Divya, thanks so much for joining us here at UNESCO for Philosophy Day, Philosophy Night indeed. And the first question I want to ask you is, how does it feel to be part of this kind of event? Not your traditional academic seminar or conference, but basically a festival, a show, where philosophy is central, but so much else is going on. How do you feel about that way of doing philosophy?
I feel very happy that at a time when, for instance, in the country that I live in, which is India, we are inventing new days, war memorial days, surgical strike days. I think it's great that we have a philosophy day, because I see here people from all walks of life. I see different formats, so it's not just a new format, but it's the mixture of formats, which recognizes that philosophy can be done in many ways. I think today we have come to identify philosophy with the university, which itself is struggling. It's kind of last gasps, because it started as a public institution, but it is becoming increasingly privatized. There's difficulty with funds, and we think that philosophers are professors, but that was not the case in the longest history of philosophy, and that should never be the case. So I think having this one day devoted at UNESCO to philosophy, to call it the World Philosophy Day, which means to go beyond the idea of narrow traditions of philosophy, and to just let people mix, talk to each other, talk in various registers, not simply in a high technical way, but also in a way which is conversational, which tries to explain things, which mixes it with music, with exhibitions. I really congratulate UNESCO for having organized it.
Thanks so much. You mentioned India, and one of the questions I wanted to ask is what geography means to you in intellectual terms. It's very common to define people by where they come from, and even that's ambiguous, because there are usually several different ways of defining a particular geography. In terms of continents or in terms of countries. You could be defined as from the subcontinent or as Indian, and of course you could reject geographical determinations. How do you see the geography of intellectual life these days, and how would you wish to fit within that geography?
Yes, I think this is a very important question, because it draws attention to two aspects of philosophy. One is that people do philosophy, and everyone is defined at least by three conditions. If I give a quick answer, I would like to invoke Hannah Arendt, who spoke of triadic human condition, which is of work, action, and labor. And so all of us have to live, survive. We need institutions which will guard our freedoms, and these conditions are unevenly distributed in the world. And so where you are based makes an impact on whether you have access to institutions, to the freedoms, to do philosophy. It's not a profession that is very monetarily rewarding. So it's a difficult choice. At the same time, it's an urgent and passionate choice, because when we ask fundamental questions about who we are, how we want to be with each other, which for which one remembers a term from Heidegger, Mitsein, being with, this is the stuff of politics, but we can immediately see that it takes place through a battle of ideas. How do I want to be identified? Do I want to be identified permanently through one label such as Indian? I think the contention over it is both political and philosophical. In that sense, the second aspect of philosophy, where it's always trying to create freedoms, but always also characterized by some of these conditions which are geographically determined. And by geographically, I think one could be more exact and say that these are geopolitical conditions. And so I think World Philosophy Day, the program that you had, the mixture of people, that also draws attention to this condition. It tries to provide a new condition. We do know that not everybody can have access to these institutions. So I do reject the label Indian in favor of the subcontinent, because the subcontinent is a place formed by millions of cultural interactions, historic interactions, which cannot be confined to any one identity. Whereas the moment we say India, or the name of any country, any nation for that matter, even France where we are currently located, the first sense we give is of a narrower identity. And I think philosophy, by its nature, rebels against them. But also politically, we must very actively rebel against them, because we are at a time where there is a crisis of identity in politics. There's a crisis of the movement of people the crisis of refugeehood, of migration. So the more people are everywhere, the more we recognize everyone's strife, the more open we have to be, while recognizing the conditions, without having a false utopic idea that some people are free of conditions in philosophy. So both things to be into.
That geography you refer to has a history, of course, and it is the history of essentially nationalism, both successful nationalism, which has created states, and unsuccessful nationalism, which has left fractures within states. You have contributed it to.
Maybe.
Yeah.
We can have an edit in between. I don't
We
know
can
what's
have
happening.
the kids deliberately messed up the video.
Maybe that's part of interruption as a Brechtian tactic.
Exactly. So the history of that geography is the history of nationalism, successful, unsuccessful. And in that respect, I'm struck that you devoted work specifically to Gandhi as one of the leading figures of self-determination in the subcontinent, which then became self-determination for India, which didn't pre-exist the Gandhi struggle itself. What does that choice of subject mean for you in philosophical terms, and how does it connect to what you were saying earlier about your intellectual and imaginary geography?
As a philosopher based in the subcontinent, what I have experienced for the longest time is that this identity of being Indian and the narrow history, which is an exclusionary historical construction, imposes itself upon all of us who are engaged intellectually either inside or outside the university, which is this obligation, a post-colonial obligation, if I may say, to somehow do philosophy as a post-colonial act against Eurocentrism, against what is broadly called the West. I think these are all facetious labels. And if one's own task is predefined in this way, then it already restricts one's freedom, and it also restricts philosophy. I would even say it's counter to philosophy. What I mean is that Gandhi, in fact, provided the conditions for this construction of India. It's quite true in a sense that he's the father of the nation, which is how he's celebrated. If we go into history, we will find that there are many other strands which contributed to the anti-colonial struggle. It's called the national struggle for independence. But we conveniently forget many of these strands. We also forget tensions, contradictions, oppositions even to Gandhi's own vision. But somehow that vision and the basic idea behind it, which is to oppose Eurocentrism or to oppose the so-called epistemic violence of the West, is our primary task. And this obligation on each of us, on someone of my generation, to continue this post-colonial, anti-colonial task, is to forget that this is a false construction. It's a false construction because my very existence today bespeaks a modernity which is thanks to the collision of peoples, cultures, technologies, of course exploitative, which happened with colonialism, and this is true of many parts of the world. We have had a long history of many kinds of empires, of which the British colonial empire is a relatively recent one. We could speak of other empires, one could speak of the neoliberal empire. But to act as though we could select from this history something which is an Indian identity, rebellious identity, while rejecting everything else that was produced in this encounter, that is a false problem. Someone like Gandhi actually said that philosophy itself is evil. Philosophy is something that is Western. The university as an institution, modern education, is something that is evil. We have to go back to certain native traditions. But there are complicated reasons why he said that. I can't go into it. But is that how one should do philosophy? I don't think any of these constraints apply. So, to do philosophy, I felt that with my co-author Shajmohan, that we had to first of all do kind of clearing of these conditions. We had to act against these conditions and maybe produce new conditions to philosophy. So you couldn't do it without having fought against and cleared the ground which was set by Gandhi and subsequently by many post-colonialist theorists, all of whom are invested in this idea that our intellectual pursuit is primarily a continuation of anti-colonial struggle, because colonialism may have formally ended, economically and politically ended, but culturally and epistemically it has not ended. I'm not convinced of that. And so the first book had to be, I think, a book on Gandhi. And that's why it's called Gandhi and Philosophy rather than Gandhi's Philosophy.
Thank you very much for being with us on the Facebook Live channel. I think one obvious, I suppose, corollary of what you're saying, and I can't pronounce that word, is that attempts to sanitize philosophy are doomed to fail. And the one thing we've definitely not done here is sanitize philosophy. We were interrupted. We have background noise. We're in a space where lots of things are happening, but they too are things about philosophy. So thanks for sharing.